You stumble across them everywhere, in villages and cities, in the smartest neighborhoods and the most run down. They lurk behind overgrown gardens, decaying beneath veils of moss and ivy. And they are the witch cities of Japan, mysterious tokens of social decay in one of the wealthiest societies in the world. Called akaya, or abandoned homes, they have spread like mold in the past few years. The last time the government made a count 5 years ago, it found 8.5 million houses standing empty nationwide, which is 13% of the total. There are streets in which almost every house has been abandoned. From the small towns and villages in Japan, children there have moved to the big cities to find new opportunities, and the properties that they leave behind when they die have little value. Often, the cost of knocking down a decaying old house is more than the resale value of the land on which it stands. For the heirs, it is cheaper just to leave the old place untended than to deal with all the bother. It's predicted that by 2040, nearly 900 towns and villages across Japan will face a risk of extinction. The number of abandoned homes has doubled in a generation, and a third of Japanese houses will be uninhabited by 2038 unless they are knocked down. In the small towns and villages of the countryside, the phenomenon is easy to understand, but it is harder to fathom why witch houses have proliferated in Japan's richest cities. In Japan's richest cities, the demographic crisis is at its most acute. Elderly people living ever longer, and young people not giving birth to replacement children. This means fewer people in the towns and villages to support their economies, whether for shopping, running businesses, farming, or spending money in local establishments. Record numbers of young Japanese have given up on marriage, government research shows, which is a huge blow to efforts to halt the community's collapsing birth rate and shrinking population. An annual survey by a government think tank shows that 17% of men and 15% of women aged between 18 and 34, roughly 1 in 6, do not intend to get married. These figures are the highest since the surveys began in 1982. They confirm a long-running and seemingly unstoppable trend of declining rates of marriage and birth, resulting in a shrinking and aging population that has the potential to break government finances in the long term. Japan is producing fewer babies than at the end of the 19th century, and as a result, demographic crisis is threatening the economy, industry, and welfare system. It is caused by Japan's low fertility rate, which is just 1.08 as opposed to the replacement level of 2.1 needed to maintain the population. 1.08 also falls below the government's current target rate of 1.8. The latest figures from the Japanese government show that the country's population fell below 126 million in 2021, a drop of 726,000. Japan's population reached its peak of 128.1 million in 2008. Since then, it has shed 3 million people and the decline is continuing. Calculations by research institutes have predicted that the population will fall below 100 million by 2048 and to 88 million by 2065. A third of the country, more than 40 million people, will have vanished in just over half a century, and these landmarks now seem likely to be passed even earlier. Nearly 30% of the population is over 65 years old. As the birth rate shrinks, lifespans are increasing, so government finances will face a crisis, as a shrinking number of young working taxpayers have to support a growing proportion of elderly people. Starting in 2030, labor shortages are projected to begin reducing economic growth by an average of 0.3% a year. Other research suggests that married and unmarried Japanese are not copulating as much as they used to, and the factors that have resulted in this may include young people socializing in groups more, making it harder to break off as a couple, or the rise of antisocial tendencies in Japanese youth fueled by a number of reasons, but some research suggests that much of the problem simply comes down to money. Salaries among male workers have declined since the Japanese bubble economy of the 1980s. And a 2017 analysis found that male workers earned 50.5% lower wages than those of the same age group in 1991. Jennifer Robertson, professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, writes that the state is very conservative and wants to maintain the heteronormativity of marriage and this pink and blue binary system of the sexual and gender division of labor, Robertson said. Until that changes, they're going to be suffering from the huge expense of maintaining an elderly population. The government has been trying to address the issue of the population crisis, from financial incentives to encouraging couples to have children. Ultimately, however, the challenge of an aging population and the resulting shortage of workers and home buyers may be unsolvable. In the 20th century, Japan experienced two major population spikes. The first after World War II, and the second during the economic explosion of the 1980s. Both created housing shortages, which led to cheap, mass-produced homes that were quickly erected in densely populated towns and cities. Setagaya Ward in Tokyo contains some of the capital's most desirable neighborhoods, but it also has 50,000 abandoned houses, more than any municipality in Japan. Sometimes there is an obvious reason. The house is at the top of a steep slope, for example, or accessible only by narrow alleys, difficult to drive a car down. But the problem also has its roots in history. Pre-war houses were made to last, with the expectation that they would be the home to a family for several generations. After aerial bombing laid waste to the cities, the priority was to provide housing in quantity, and quality was neglected. The new apartment blocks were not expected to survive more than 40 years. The most desirable homes were new, they did not keep their value. In Japan, a new home is like a new car, which loses much of its value as soon as it's driven out of the showroom. Until the late 1980s, the land on which a house was built could be relied on to raise in value. But then the property bubble burst spectacularly. In Japan, buying your own home has not been the solid investment that it has been in Britain, for example. To the children of recently deceased parents, their ramshackle house on the narrow Tokyo alley can be a greater burden than an asset. So the result is that owners have little incentive to maintain or improve any property if it becomes uninhabitable. There is no clear financial benefit in restoring it. An increasing number of Japanese families are choosing to just leave the house behind and buy or rent a new one. This combination of factors has resulted in the proliferation of witch houses in Japan today. Witch houses are also contagious, which makes the problem worse. A cluster of abandoned homes affects the value of those around it. Some local governments are imposing taxes on abandoned properties and increasing their power to knock them down. At present, they can only do this to structures on the verge of collapse. But the core of the problem is insoluble. Japan's population is shrinking. Since 2008, it shed more than 2 million people. The witch houses are the ghosts of a country that is no more, the visible sign of an irreversible dwindling. In Tokyo, the much publicized hollowing out of the property market may yet give way to a more sustainable urban landscape and a new generation of housing. But until then, more and more towns will be haunted by the ghosts of abandoned homes. Alright, so that's gonna be it, guys. Please subscribe for more Squalid Suburbs, and thank you for watching.